لازم التنين. You get what I mean, Victor? This one
is for the recording.
And but for you get what
sure.
Victor? This one
is for the recording.
And but for you get what
sure.
This one
is for the recording. Sure.
لما احنا سعداء حضور تواجدكم معنا اليوم حضور اللقاء التعريفي بالتحول الرقمي. كما ذكرنا في الدعوه الهدف الاساسي من هذه الدعوه هو تسليط الضوء على التحول الرقمي. وطبعا ذكرنا انه الحين كل هذا الطريقه اللي بدات رحله التحول الرقمي. وذكرنا كلمه رحله لان التحول الرقمي ليس مشروع انما رحله مستمرة تحتاج تكون طويلة أو مستمرة. تحتاج من أهم أسباب نجاحها هو دعم التعاون الجميع. ونحن في مكتب التحول الرقمي خلال تقريبا 6 شهور الماضية كنا نعمل مع أقوى بيوت الخدمات في التحول الرقمي والمحلية والعالمية لبناء خطة التحول الرقمي الشامل. ثم نظرات طالعة عن إدارة هذا التحول. ودي بصراحة إني أتكلم أكثر وأستوعب لأن الوقت قليل ونستفيد من وجود يرضى معنا اليوم. فابتداء أحب أوجه شكري للحضور وشكري لسعادة المحاضرة الرعاية الكريمة لهذا اللقاء ولسعادة راعي مشروع التحول الرقمي خمسة الرحمن المهند. ولا ننسى سعادة مدير خدمة المعلومات المهندس سعادة الشريف لأن تعاون معنا كثير ودعمنا وسخرنا من الأمانة البشرية والمالية مساعدتنا في نقطة التحول الرقمي. والشكر موصول للزملاء في كافة وما أنسى دكتور جان special thanks to Dr. Jan Martin for being with us today. He traveled all the way from UK to Saudi Arabia to deliver this session. So hopefully you have informative and interactive session. أتمنى أن تسأل presentation سلايدز كثيرة ولكن حسب التوجه وحسب المداخلات الدكتور مارتن راح احنا بدنا اليوم من وجود معنا بدنا نستفيد ونتفاعل وش التحول الرقمي وكيف ممكن فعلا يساعدنا ويدعمنا في تحقيق اهدافنا الاستراتيجية كل إدارة. فشكرا لكم معنا. دكتور مارتن.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. We just had a session where we looked at the larger trends and the need for digital transformation. And what I hope to do in this session is to really have an interactive discussion with you about what you think are needed to be done for TVTC. So I really hope you can engage in questions. I will walk through rather quickly what we talked about earlier, but it's going to be more of an overview to sort of get started. And also, please bear with me because as an old professor, I'm set in my ways in how I want to present, as you probably know that many professors are, which means I'm not used to this particular technology. So some of the ways I usually present is not available in this particular technology. So please bear with me when I try to navigate the system. So one of the ways it's different is that I usually use the clicker, so now I have to walk over and press here. But I wanted to show you that this thing about digital or information technology or education is not new, in a sense. That we've been doing this for a very long time. And this just happens to be an example from the Old Kingdom in Egypt, where already back then, being a scribe was a really high-paid profession. And there were all existing scribes who actually made extra money, or in this case, extra sustenance, by providing solved examples. You could trade all the scribe tests. And the interesting thing here is that papyrus, which I call the Rind papyrus or Ahmed papyrus, which you can find at the British Museum, and this is actually over 60 solved mathematical problems. And the interesting part is that back then, you had to pay about a small goat in order to get this. And nowadays, we do exactly the same thing. So what you see on the right-hand side there is really a test you can do before you go into the British test before higher education, GCSE. And that app, which also talks about mathematics and geometry kind of thing, is really costing about 1/400th of a goat, assuming that the goat prices have been level during the centuries here. Of course, in order to do that, you do need to have an infrastructure around that. You need to have network, you need to have the Apple Store, and you need to buy the phone as well. And that phone in itself costs you at least half a goat or 2 goats, depending on the level of phone you use. So what I wanted to show with this is that this thing about education is age-old. It's not new. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to apply information technology, new information technology, to make it cheaper and more effective. So when we talk about new trends, please bear this in mind, that we have always been humans and we do things, but using technology to improve and be more effective. Any questions on that? I want to get started? No? Not yet? Yeah. So as a former professor, my background is actually physical organic chemistry. So that's where my PhD is in. And what my route in information technology is because I complained so much about what IT did not do for me. So they told me, you do it better yourself. And I ended up as the CIO of Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, where I'm from. My job at Gartner isn't really to talk about specific technologies, like blockchain or identity and access management or database, stuff like that. My job is really to understand the mission of a particular industry, a particular institution, and help you find the best technology to match your mission. So I really try to understand the needs of your institution before applying a technology. The good thing is, of course, that being at Gartner, I have hundreds and hundreds, actually more than 2,000 other analysts who can help me when we find that technology. So that's something I'll walk through later today. But essentially what I am today is more of a social scientist, trying to understand how you best instill change in an organization. And one thing I learned very quickly was that a lot of people are like me, not very good at actually reading text and parsing text. It's more visual. We need to do things like is in the mock equation at the bottom. So what that talks about is that we're not really talking about only technology anymore and how cool it is. Yes, there is an element of that. A lot of us who are in IT, we are really interested in using the latest gadgets, like the smartwatches and of course Alexa and stuff like that. But it is really about trying to understand the functionality of technology in the context of people and processes, divided by the resources we put in. And that gives you the yield for the organization. And of course, as you can see directly, the IT department alone cannot do this. We need the help of you in order to understand how the technology is best used in the classrooms or throughout the organization. Long gone are the days where we put up a network or gave you the Office package and we're all done. Now it's much more complicated, and we really need to together treat IT as a team sport with a common goal. Unfortunately, and this is unfortunately also a common problem with these kind of uploads systems, is that they don't have all the fonts that are needed for some of the slides. So what you're supposed to be seeing towards the end there is actually a happy face, a smiley face. The reason I put it there is that it's really important to get happy end users that actually use the system. So the first part of the equation is kind of logical, is really thinking through, but it turns out that a lot of us are actually, it's hard work doing that logical thinking. And a lot of us do it with the stomach, you know, a gut feeling in terms of what we try to do. So already from the beginning, you need to engage people in the design of the tools so that they want to use it. I gave the example earlier that there's another university in this region who were really proud introducing Blackboard and said, hey, we have 50% of our faculty using Blackboard, which is good. But it does at the same time mean that you're multiplying the whole yield equation with 0.5. Ideally, you should be at 1, but in my experience, that's not possible with education institutions. You probably end up somewhere about 0.8. So not everybody will get on board, but I think you should get to about 0.8. Make sense? The thing I want to say here is that this is a team sport, and that's what we need to do here. I also want to emphasize that the tools we provide in change management are definitely not about starting from scratch, starting from zero again. It's really built on your already existing strategic plans and vision. And I think, and then I recognize this in the whole region, I think you have a lot of good leaders who really understand the importance of education, understand the importance of helping the future generations be the best they can be. And when we look at especially this slide, which is a very complex slide, there's actually 62 different dots over there. This, I mean, I would say that's really overwhelming. As an end user in particular, it's really hard to take in. It's good to have that kind of map with all the options. It's really good. So you've done really great work there. But in order to engage all the users and even students out there, you need to do what I call the adjacent possible. That's it. The next step. So it's really up to you to help your organizations or your parts of organizations to get a vision of what is the next step. So for me, that's a big part of what leadership is. I also noticed there's a fair amount of change management dots in that map. And actually, that's my specialty. So what I try to do is really to provide you with a number of frameworks that can help you get a common vision as an organization. And I'll show you a few of those today. But before I do that, this is my disclaimer. As you can imagine, I talk to a lot of my former academic friends. And you know, of course, that any kind of academic, especially if you have a PhD, you're actually trained to find flaws in other people's arguments. And they like doing that. So this is sort of usually a good disclaimer to have in the beginning. But it's actually very true in the sense that all models, all stories are essentially limited representations of reality. And we need to use them for what they are good at, not only point out the flaws, and there will be definitely flaws. So here's the story, and here's the first example where a build would have made it more powerful. The Gartner Hype Cycle is one of those frameworks that is really helpful in quickly assessing technologies, new emerging technologies. And that was one of the reasons I became a client a long time ago. I presented on it a lot of times, and this mental image was actually given to me by one client. She was a professor and also a CEO at an Austrian university. And she said, many faculty in the classroom, teachers in the classroom, when they see the Gartner Hype Cycle, they see a tsunami of technologies hitting the classroom. And they're afraid of what all these technologies are going to do to their everyday life, their teaching, and their profession. Of course, for me, that's actually sad. Because what I think is that the hype cycle is really a, let's see how this works. Okay. Is really a toolbox for the CIO and the organization to find technologies that we can turn into services for the next 5 to 10 years. It's really about emerging trends and understanding what's out there and possible to do. And I actually used to use an empty hype cycle together with the leadership team and the different deans at the organization. And we would usually sit down and talk about what are the new cool technologies you know about that we need to implement or discuss. And where do you think they are on the hype cycle? The reason I use the hype cycle is simple, because it's a really simple framework. And it essentially means is that there is an innovation trigger. And you've seen this a lot of times. You get that first view of an article in the press. And for instance, it says that blockchain is going to change the world. Or artificial intelligence is going to change the world. And very quickly, you get a peak of inflated expectations. Hundreds and thousands of articles out there about how good this is going to be. Of course, then some of us, especially IT people, but some also a lot of professors, we actually start using this technology. And we're starting to noticing the flaws in the technology, what it cannot do. And then we plummet down into the trough of disillusionment. Some of us who are really invested in technology stay in there. And we try to find out what it's really good for. And that's where you go up the slope of enlightenment and eventually into the plateau of productivity. I find this very useful in engaging with faculty leadership because it helps me show a couple of really important things. First of all, there is going to be a peak of inflated expectations. There is going to be a plateau of productivity that is lower than that peak. And before you get there, there will much likely be some kind of trough of disillusionment. If you understand all these kind of things, then it becomes much easier to do that journey together. Another thing that's really important here when you talk about this is that it used to be 5-10 years ago that we didn't do anything until it essentially has left the trough, especially as a bit more risk-averse type of organization, which many higher ed institutions are. Because that's where we know the cost, we know the quirks of the technology and so on. But I would argue that our job today is to teach for the future. We teach our students for future professions. And if we don't have experiments on the early phase, the red over there of the hype cycle, we're not really doing our job. So as a digital transformation team, if you really want to go all the way to digital transformation, that is something you need to have in your organization. There is an issue here in the sense that you need to accept learning by failure. Because a lot of these things that are early on the hype cycle, they will not prove to be as good as first thought. And of course, when you do things early on the hype cycle, it's really much harder to know the exact value of them in the organization. Which again means that it has to be a teamwork. We need to work together with you out there in the classrooms in order to understand how to use this. Make sense? So this is the first detailed version, if you will. This is just the education hype cycle with about 40 innovation profiles out of 1,600. But I invite you to ask questions about anything on there that you find interesting. Any takers?
Yeah, just coming back to the point where you said learning from error. Maybe this is not necessary because we might learn from other people who have implemented any digitalization or a proportion of digitalization in classroom teaching.
Yeah.
Instead of trial, learning by trial.
Yeah, so the question is about maybe we don't need to do the experiment ourselves. We can learn from others, and that's certainly true. So it's really a question about how early you want to be in the hype as well. So and as I said, it's a lot about the risk averseness of the organization. And as we will talk about later, it's more about deciding the waypoints on the way to digital transformation and how much you want to do. Gartner's job is really about that, to bring in information about how others have done it and learning from them. I'll give you one example. So one of the key things we're working a lot with right now is actually AI education applications in there. And Deakin University, they are not risk averse. They actually accept a lot of risk. And they even have digital transformation as a part of their university strategy. So the chancellor, the president of Deakin University, she actually says things like, you know, we don't want to have online students anymore. We have cloud students. We don't care where students are geographically. We only care where they are academically. That kind of thing. So digital transformation is really part of their university strategy. So what they have a digital transformation team in there, and they're constantly looking for new things to try within education. And one of those things are, of course, AI. So they signed a deal with IBM's in 2014. That's really, really early. And they produced the first AI-based chatbot based on that. So that was late 2015 when they managed to do that. And as I said last time, already in March by 2016, it managed to answer 80% out of 22,000 questions on campus. That's a lot. Because they were early, they had to spend a lot of money, a lot of effort, but they also got more than 300 international articles in the press. So for them, it was a huge boon in terms of branding and PR in that case. And of course, in Australia, the situation is different in the sense that they actually depend on having international students from China and India and so on. So again, going back to what is your mission and where do you need to be in order to fulfill that mission? To your point, when they signed the agreement, there was really no competition. IBM was the only one that could deliver on the cognitive services, the IBM chatbot. Already by end of 2016, they've actually discontinued the collaboration with IBM because they realized that IBM was a good provider, but it wasn't the best option for them in terms of the way they deliver services, how they work in projects and so on. So they actually, with the knowledge they've gained in the first phase, they built their own AI conversational platform. And also because they've done a really good job on cleaning the data, building application interfaces to all their data sources like the student information, the learning management system, and so on. They could actually switch to the new framework within 2 weeks, which is, it's amazing. I mean, in all kinds of IT organizations, doing that kind of major switch between two different delivery mechanisms, that's really, really good. Yeah. And of course, now what they have, again, is that they are ahead of the game. And they provide a much more advanced version of personal assistance. They can do proactive work with the students, helping them to answer questions about library references, how to learn certain topics, and so on. So that's an example in that case. But as I said, it's up to you. Yes?
Now, coming back to the mission you said. The mission here is the BTC, providing, supplying the labor work in Saudi with trained labor talents. So with the labor, most of it is practical labor. So we need to be teaching them vocational, practical skills. So maybe what can be digitalized fully,
Yeah.
and what can be digitalized like some proportion of
Yep.
digitalization.
Definitely, that's a key point. And actually, that's a good segue to, let's see if I can do this. This is the example of how I try to do this. So this is a slide deck of more than 160 slides. And the question you ask, we typically deal with in a framework where we talk about what we call the higher education business model scenarios. Actually, let me start here, because this is a good slide. Also, this is also typically built, so sorry for the amount of information there. But what it tries to talk about is that there are actually two strands. Exactly what you're saying, that there's a business side on the left-hand side, where you really try to understand what are the trends in education, especially vocational education in this case. What are the business models we need to set up? And actually, if you're from more pure research that I am, talking about business models is very contentious. Because obviously you're not doing things for money, and we're not. But I would argue we all need to do things with a sustainable funding model, regardless of who pays. So in Sweden, where I come from, the government pays for all education, everything. But they do have funding models such as we get 30% of the money for a student when they in the institution. And then we get the 70% when they actually get a degree. So we're highly incentivized to make sure that they actually get to the degree. That's a good example. Of course, if you go to the US, it's very different because it's all about tuition, much more market and stuff like that. But for me, that's exactly why it is important to talk about the business model. How do we set it up, and what kind of, especially in countries like Sweden and Saudi Arabia, you can probably have a much more long-term plan in order to get to your goal than you typically do in even Australia today, actually. Anyway, we go all the way down to institutional capabilities, and before we end today, I hope to give you a very concrete example of how we can do this. But this today is very much aligned with what is technologically possible to do. So it used to be that before we actually looked at what we wanted to do, and then we saw how technology could support it. But now we're actually at the level where technology is actually impacting how we can do it. So there is really an iteration, or at least they need to come together today. And at the end of the day, what you actually need to have, I would argue, is a digital strategy that is extremely flexible. Because I mentioned AI. We didn't talk about AI before 2015, to be honest. In some of the other research we do, we've seen that the implementation of AI has risen 270% since 2015. That's a huge change. And we know that's not the last technology that will come around. There will be more. So when we talk about business models, this is the one that we use the most. And to your point, I mean, the reason this has nothing really to do with technology, to be honest. It's really about what type of institution you are in getting a common view of what we are in order to understand the capabilities we need. This comes out of a scenario planning exercise we did back in 2008. And it's really answering two questions. In this case, the focal issues are the perceived quality from the student's point of view, so collectively defined to personally defined, and also scalability from exclusive to inclusive. And the best way to show that is through examples. So the top left-hand one, only as you, that's global, economically recognized quality. So that's Oxford, Harvard, MIT, all those kind of things. It's typically the top 200 in Times ranking or something like that. If you go a bit further down, in the middle of the top one, you probably have something we call government-defined quality. If you're in the US, it's accreditation body-defined quality. Then you have everybody's you, and you, all the way to the right, you have community colleges, vocational institutions, TAPES, if you're in the Australian environment, or SENAC, if you're in the Brazilian environment, that kind of thing. And actually, one of the reasons we really wanted to do this scenario planning is because when we read strategic plans, a lot of them were really about how can we be the only as you? Because that's where the government pushes you, that's where the prestige is, that kind of thing. Not so much for vocational institutions because they have a more focused mission, but definitely for my alma mater, which is Gothenburg University. You know, we had 50,000 students. We know we were educating for the knowledge economy of Sweden. That's our job. We had one Nobel Prize winner in medicine, but it did not make us only as you. Our culture, our core, our center of gravity was really in the everybody's you. And we needed to make that clear. Just to finish off the scenario, though, because I think it's important in the vocational example, is that community-defined quality is below the horizontal line, and me not use at the extreme there. You usually have things like Wharton, Harvard Business Schools, very exclusive institutions. And as you can see, they're actually businesses within other universities or institutions within other institutions. And the reason we call it community-defined is because they usually know exactly who the employers are. There are actually not that many different employers. There's a lot of KPMG and McKinsey who hires the Harvard business graduates out of there. But a better example, I would argue, is actually Odessa College in Texas. So what Odessa College does is that they have a stackable degree for the oil industry. They know that that's their community of employers. So you're supposed to be able to go there, educate for 6 months, get some credentials, then go out into the industry and go back and forth. So it becomes more of a life education opportunity. The reason, and this maybe interests you in the sense we discussed before, the reason me not use are there is also because they're more dependent on physical locations. So you still have to have quite a bit of traditional classrooms, labs, stuff like that, which also means that you cannot scale in the same way you can do with other things, which is really about the last one. So all about you is when the student really knows what they want to learn, and they don't really care about the brand, but they do care about convenience. It should be convenient to get the education that you want. And the extreme example here are UK Open University, a lot of the private for-profits in the US, but also you have things like chartered accountants. That's a typical organization where they provide a very specific credential, license and stuff like that. So all about you is really about how you scale, but it also is, in order to scale, you don't essentially do physical things in the extreme. And please bear with me, I mean, a big part of doing scenario planning is actually to look at the extremes. So they inform the opportunities. What typically happens is that you get something that is much more, in the middle or a mix in there. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we need to be careful of the time. As a Gartner analyst, we're trained to talk all the time. So I can go on and on. But I wanted to show you one example of this in particular. While we're down here. And unfortunately, this is also a build. Whoops. But this is a real example we did with UNISA, which is University of South Africa. So UNISA is a distance education institution for about 350, 400,000 students, most in South Africa, but actually all of Sahara Africa to a large extent. So if you look at the A's up there, you see an elongated blob, the bigger blob of A. So when we talked to them first, they understood that because of their heritage, they were more of a traditional education institution, even if it's distance, and that's their core, and they were sort of dipping into the all about you section there as well, because they needed to cater to many more students. As you can see, there are 3 other A's there. So UNISA is actually a really good research institution for exactly that, education online. So they have really high-end master's educations in online education. So they already have an element of this. They actually do have a number of MBAs as well, which is, again, a very different types of delivery model. And the reason I use this example still, I did this back in 2010 with them. But back then, they also started to have a specific online subsidiary who did everything online. The tradition was paper-based, and they started to get online more about everybody's view. The reason we want to do these kind of exercises is that if you, as an institution, are in many business model quadrants, it's really hard to build a strategic plan that's focused. And in this case, what we had to do was not so much to build more technology solutions to help all of these. In this case, we actually worked with the chief financial officer to build different funding models. So the IT department focused on the bigger blob, while the other entities, they had to buy basic services from the IT department, but they actually got funding by the differentiating services from other providers. So that's how they solved that problem in that case. Unfortunately, in their case, they had a much bigger problem in the sense that it was really clear that the government wanted them not to have 350, 400,000 students. They wanted them to have 600,000 students within a couple of years. As you know, South Africa has a huge shortage of educated people. So that's a big thing for them. And of course, the only way they could really do that was go to more all about you. More adaptive learning, more personal type of learning. However, and this is a common problem in institutions that are a bit older or more traditional, the faculty said no. Because the faculty's prestige was really dependent on them going more towards only as you. That's a cultural problem which resides clearly with the leadership. And that's not something IT can solve, not at all. That's definitely something that needs to be heightened into the top leadership. We deal with that. Actually, I'll show you a few examples of how they dealt with that. Southern New Hampshire University, I mentioned before with you as well. Make sense? Yeah. So actually, let's do the digital transformation thing first, because I think it's a good setup for this. Let's see. There you go. I am going to trip over that one at some point. I hope it's at least entertaining in that case. Anyway, This is supposed to be built, but I think it's one of the most important concepts in here. It's not really a framework, but it is a concept of a journey. And what I like to give you is a story from the music industry, which I hope everyone can relate to. So we start at the analog side over there with the old LPs, and I'm old enough to own those. So I have that at home still. And of course, they had a really good business model. So you could buy 2 good songs with 10 bad ones, but you had to buy the lot. That's how they delivered it. And of course, because it was analog, that's you know, the LP setup and those kind of things. That's how they did it. They wanted to make it more efficient. So they introduced the compact disc, the CD. They digitized it all. And please note that digitization is just doing the same thing you did in an analog world, but in a digital world. You don't add any value. In this case, still 2 good songs and 10 bad ones. Well, actually, you could cram in probably 15 bad ones because you had more volume. But the same business model. The problem was that that's not how most of us wants to consume the songs. So what we wanted to do is to build our own playlist, song by song. So what happened here is that since the music industry did not provide that option, Napster came along, an external disrupting provider came along and offered that to all of us. And of course, we downloaded it, we made our own list, but it was stealing, to be fair. That's stealing of intellectual property from the musicians. Sorry?
Was it present?
Yeah. And actually, that was a forerunner of Skype. So some of the Swedish technology people who run Napster actually introduced Skype as well. So that's a similar technology. I'm Swedish, so I like to push, of course, everything Swedish. If you haven't got a Volvo, please buy one. No, sorry. The key thing there, though, is when iTunes came along, they provided a different business model, and they showed that most of us understand the connection between paying for a service and actually getting more of that service, and actually doing right with those people who produce that service. So I would argue that optimization is still having MP3 files and using iPods and that kind of thing to deliver. It's just a sustaining innovation. But combining it with the whole ecosystem of credit cards, that's transformational. Because now you could charge $1 per song and still have a profitable business. I think that's really amazing. I think that's really a breakthrough and a good example of how technology can actually provide you with new business models. Of course, nowadays, nobody really buys the songs anymore because we rent them by the millions from Spotify, another Swedish company. So hopefully what this shows is that there is a journey, and I don't think we can typically go from the analog world to the fully transformed world, digital world, in one step. I think it's important to actually start digitizing our assets, and as we do that, we start understanding how we can do things in new ways. And the first example there is actually about the textbook. So the textbooks is a really analog example, or a good analogy to the music industry. We started with the physical textbooks, and I still have a lot of them at home with all my annotations and highlights and stuff like that. And you know, we've learned through ages how to really use that type of learning material. First, we got e-readers, and e-readers back then were really poor because you couldn't do highlights, you couldn't do annotation, stuff like that. That's improved, so you can do a lot of that. And of course, one of the benefits of e-readers is that you don't have to have Stryer of biochemistry, which actually weighs about 2 kilos. You didn't have to have that in your backpack. So you could actually have a lot more books in the e-readers. But real value, that didn't really come until you started added other media that you couldn't have in the physical format, like videos, like audios. And of course, that's just sustaining innovation, I would argue, because it's sort of the next adjacent step. But doing adaptive text, That's really getting into more transformation. Because if you can provide the students with the textbooks where their tests in the textbooks actually presents new material to them, or actually guides them to the textbook in different ways, depending on how they answer, that's of real value, I would argue. And of course, we see that the natural evaluation of that is going to be what we call a MASH book. And MASH book, we still call it MASH book because we really believe in touching the history of information. So a book is actually a tremendous improvement over the scroll, as we saw the papyrus scroll over there, for one key reason. It was one curated part of content, and because you did it in a book, you could also reference particular pages in the book. So just things like that is information technology clearly change how we do things in society and education as well. In this case, the MASH book is actually produced on the net in at least 3 different components. You have a content system, content creation system even, where you actually put in your own content as a professor. You use open education resources, which is really taking off at the moment. And of course, you can use publisher content. And there are tools out there to help you pay for the intellectual property you use and how you mix it. So that's... Sorry?
Lecture Maker and other tools.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the good thing there is that they integrate with the publishers as well. So you don't have to think about the cost. It just comes out of how you design the textbook. Information is of course going to be with a learning management system. That's how you essentially distribute it. But on top of that, you will also have an adaptive learning platform. And it could be statistically based, which is more like if you have 2,000 students going through a textbook, then you will get enough statistical information to understand the different learning modes, typically. And of course, we do think that this is going to go more into artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence. My personal, what I personally want to see right now is the inclusion of emotion. There are things called emotion AI platforms out there. So the reason for that is that I actually believe that these tools need to be anthropomorphized. They need to be more like humans, because humans have always liked to work with people like. So we need to have machines that are actually engaging with us in a more human-like way. We shouldn't have to learn the machines. The machines need to learn us. And to be honest, with AI, we are closer to that, especially with emotion AI. 2 other examples there are around transcripts, but I think is really important to build a talent ecosystem, because it's really about matching the needs of the employers more towards real time. Of course, in education, it's very hard to do real time, because as soon as you understand there's a new skill that needs to be taught, then of course you need to develop a course to teach it and so on. But you at least need to have methods to quickly understand what are new needs for skills out there.
When you say, okay, academic education or vocational education,
yeah.
I think the application of education is very hard to fit in this framework.
Yeah, exactly. But the way I look at it is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is how can you modularize more of what you do? So instead of having very long courses or programs, how can I actually segment them so that you use those modules in order to quickly change the direction? It's almost like object-oriented programming. So I know this is the CIO, so I use some technical terms there in that case. What I wanted to show you here is how this kind of thinking can actually help guide a discussion about what you need to do as an organization. Because I strongly believe that you need to have a common vision, a common view. Yes, please. Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
That's fine. Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organization for having you with us today. And my question is, let us to explain what does mean transfer. Does it mean to transfer from level to level? Or does transfer means the knowledge and the technology, the method? That's what they need. Exactly what they need. Because it's transferring. Is there any change will happen in the future, or just to be changed as it is?
No, so there are actually two ways you can do it, and actually this model is there to help you do that. So to your point, if you look at the x-axis digital optimization, it's really about doing what you used to do and optimize it as much as possible. But you don't change the business model, you don't change the way you teach or anything like that. Digital transformation, the y-axis, is more about really changing the way you do things.
What the data? Did you change
The data, actually the way you deliver and stuff like that as well. And actually, maybe let's go into this example here, because I think it will show you clearly what I mean. So, oops. So what we have here, here we go. Actually, let me show you this example first. So this is Georgia Tech University. And you know, it's rather high-end engineering school in the US. And one of the they had is the students they had coming on campus is relatively few, and they wanted to scale it up. And this is back in the day where MOOCs, massive online courses, were really popular. So they started working with Udacity to really scale up their education. So what Udacity did was really taking the professor's content and producing videos and assessments and all that kind of thing, and put it into a MOOC delivery model. So the professors didn't have to change anything. Yeah. But what Udacity did was actually making this scalable and added their teaching assistants and help and those kind of things as well. What it enabled them to do with funding from an external party like AT&T, enabled them to do actually to produce a model where they wanted to have 6,000 students in the traditional degree program online. But also what they wanted to do, which they could do because it was digitized, they actually gave certificate courses for another 2,000. And also what they could do, because they had it online, they could also offer students to test education. So if they were good enough but didn't have the formal requirements to get in, they could actually test them and allow them a seat. A big part is that the cost was way lower, about $6,600 compared to $45,000 per year. So that's a huge benefit in itself. But it didn't really change the way they did it. The next example, well, actually, I mean, I want to point out this one because I think the numbers are it's really amazing in terms of how they increase the scale, the volume. One thing they also saw, which I think is interesting, is especially from a vocational point of view and a lifelong education point of view, is that the students that came on campus were typically Chinese and Indian, which were much younger. And the students who actually came online were typically Americans, which were much older, in the midst of their working life, who wanted to develop their skills. So it was really very different markets, if you will, of students, which I definitely think is a nice idea why you should do things like this. The thing I wanted to show you, though, is this example, because I think it's more close to a vocational, potential vocational model. So this, and also how you do the change, to your point. So this is Southern New Hampshire University. So it's not that old, it's 1932 or 34, 32, I think. And what they had is a traditional campus. So they have programs, masters, bachelors, and all those kind of things. And they have about 8,000 students on that campus. And yes, they've started doing online and stuff like that on the traditional model. But what they realized, and this is their president, who is really focused on educating the masses, that he knows what business model he wants to do. So he said that my vision is to educate the lowest 10% wage earners in large companies. That's my vision. That's how we need to do this. And in order to do that, we need to deliver a competency-based education model. So what they did, sorry? At the same time, yes. Yeah, exactly. And here's the trick, though, and I can relate to that. They did not do that in the old organization. They actually created a specific subsidiary to do that, because if you do competency-based education, there's different people who create the content, different people who deliver the content, different people who mentor on the content, and different people who do the assessment. Traditional course, and I'm from that old model, one professor, one course. I do everything. I create content, deliver, I mentor, and I assess. That's a very nice model. If you can be a professor in that model, that's a nice model. Being a professor in this teamwork thing, for most professors, that won't work. If your expectation is the old model. That was why they had to hire in new people into the new model. So that's one of the ways you can do change within the existing organization. And in this case, it paid off a lot. I mean, now they have over 100,000 students in that business model alone. So that's, I think, is a good example. Yeah. And actually, let me go into a very practical. Well, actually, let's do this first. Here we go. I just wanted to finish this one. I mean, there's really no. I don't put any different value on where you want to go. It's really up to you as an institution. But I do really want you to understand the differences, and of course, to your point about risk averseness and stuff we talked about earlier, that you build a waypoint through that. So, and actually start. I would urge you to start with the digital optimization routes, because that will help you learn, the organization learn what is possible from a digital point of view. But I definitely want you to talk about digital potential. And one of the examples here is about Walmart is really one of the most efficient retail organizations in the world. They know a lot about their physical stores and what is sold and not sold, and they have a highly optimized supply chain. So they're really good at optimization. But as you know, they are now in competition with Amazon, because Amazon has found a way, which I think is closer to digital transformation, to know about each individual customer. You know, everything you buy through Amazon, every device you use, and that kind of thing, is really feeding their information about you and how they can suggest new products to sell to you. So those are two different models, and depending on the digital potential in your particular business model or industry. So actually, to your point, for vocational things where you do have to have a lot of labs and mechanic shops and stuff like that, you're probably lower in the digital potential in your line of business than a highly, digital, like programming, for instance.
I think because we have a mainstream of more than 45 majors.
Yeah.
From accounting and software to complete labor.
Yeah.
Complete like plumbing, mechanical and automotive. Maybe we have both. So yes, something can be digitalized.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, and it's a good segue into the last section I'll do. But I'll show one more slide here first. and this is the way we do it nowadays, it's better to plot the actual programs rather than the whole institution. Because to your point, I mean, accounting is probably a higher digital potential than plumbing. So you really need to get down to that level. And of course, when we talk about this, that most of them are today in the lower left quadrants, please be aware there's a ton of examples who are already in the top right-hand example. Especially, we've already talked about things like Deakin University and also Southern New Hampshire University. But in the interest of time, let me actually make sure we get through a special model. Oops. This is all the way down in 99. Do you see anything? We'll get there in a moment. So I've only shown you a couple of the frameworks we use. Building on what you said, essentially, there is a top-down version, because I do think it's really important for the senior leadership to show direction and sort of set the boundaries of what the organization should do. But because you don't teach accounting in the same way you teach plumbing, you also need a bottom-up approach. So in this case, we're actually going to combine 3 different tools. You've already seen the hype cycle, but I'll add the benefit map and also something called the digital moment as well. So I'll walk through this in the remaining time, just to give you an example of what it is. So the first part of this is to really envision the digital moment and balance the benefit map. And of course, what the digital moment is something, it's a body of research that Gartner have done for quite some time, which talks about business moments. Of course, as I said before, the word business is a bit sensitive in education, so I'd like to talk about it as a digital education moment. But then I realized, hey, there's a lot of digital moments everywhere, like in the workplace and so on. I like to call it just a digital moment. The Gartner definition, though, is essentially the same. So it's an event that triggers a lot of actions that leads to a very specific objective. And if you've read Clayton Christensen's work of sustaining and disruptive innovation, that's a really good segue into this, or something I recommend reading, especially his book, Innovator Solution. And he has a hilarious example of the job to get done of a milkshake. If you search for that on Google, you'll find some really interesting videos. The only thing I will say is that the job to get done on a milkshake is very different in the morning and the Friday afternoon. I hope that enticed you. The thing, though, for us, making things digital and being in IT, is that we need to know from you a long time before the digital moment happens what's in it. Because setting up networks, setting up tools, building software takes time. So that's really my reason for investing a lot of time in this. So here's a digital moment from that I've written some time ago. It's based on an outdoor lab. You remember, I'm a chemist, so that's what I'm comfortable with. Unfortunately, I noticed it is actually essentially impossible to read it. But I'll walk you through it. So first of all, there needs to be some kind of headline. What is this all about? In this case, it's about an outdoor lab. There needs to be a job to get done. And in this case, through several iterations, we identified it was to promote and demonstrate real learning to many stakeholders. So that's the job to get done. The important part of this, though, is to tell a story. And this story is about Maya, the student, who gets a tweet management system that she has an assignment to do. But she's already, in her mind, started preparing. So the second one there is that she started using open databases like European Union database. So we have a lot of subsidies of agriculture in the European Union. So you can find farmers in those databases. And of course, you can, with that, you can also get approval to work on their fields. So that's one key thing. So when she gets to the field, she actually starts taking samples with IoT, Internet of Things. So there's actually sensors connected to her smartphone about pH and nitrogen levels in the soil. She also takes photos of the crops and the fauna in the fields, and it feeds that directly back into the laboratory information system at the school. The crops are automatically identified in that system, so that's augmented reality encyclopedia, essentially. So I typically say that information technology is actually the art of workarounds. Very often, or actually not very often, but quite often at least, it doesn't work as intended. But with good people, you can always find a different way around it, just like we have done today. The example I wanted to tell you is actually, so that's the Dean of Music at the Luleå Technical University in Sweden. So we did this exercise with them, and he actually said that, hey, I have a story to tell. So a couple of years ago, back then, there was 2 students coming up to him and say, there's 3 different versions of Smoke on the Water, a popular American song, on YouTube. Which is the best one? And of course, he said, there's a pedagogical opportunity here. So he recorded 2 new ones and put on YouTube. And then they had a discussion, the whole class, afterwards about that. That has developed into that every student, every year, has to record at least 1 popular song, the same popular song, and put it on YouTube, so that they can all have a conversation about the different nuances of music. The interesting part here is, of course, not only I think it's a beautiful example of good pedagogy, but did the CIO know about that? Of course not. That was something that the professor did in his classroom without the knowledge of the rest of the organization. So if you do this correctly, this can actually help you promote good ideas into other classrooms. In this case, the hotspot thing there, I tried to put in things that back then was a bit more hot, like badges, which can lead to gamification, obviously mashups you saw in there, and augmented reality encyclopedia, which is back then actually was new. Not so much now, actually. And of course, in the enabler quadrants, you will see a lot of the same things. To be honest, almost whenever you do a digital moment, you will have identity and access management. You will have things, and you will have a need for integration. So that's service-oriented architecture up there. So why do we do this? Well, as I said, there is a tension between the individual, the faculty side, and also what needs to be standardized for low cost of transaction. So building a good benefit map that is balanced is actually a key part of this. Because a lot of faculty, if they can see that you're actually providing them with tools they can use in their classroom for their purposes, they will accept quite a lot of standardization if they understand that context. And of course, we talked a lot about change management and getting the same view. There's nothing that beats actually doing this exercise. To be honest, coming from the digital transformation team or the IT department with the ready-made solution, that's usually not a good idea. You can have a lot of ideas, but it has to be a group that develop this together. Otherwise, you will rarely get buy-in. But it doesn't end there. We're actually going to finish off with the hype cycle as well. As you probably noticed, I love the hype cycle. So there's scarcely one model I don't use, I use without the hype cycle. So in this case, the same dots, we haven't changed the dots, but we placed them on the hype cycle. So obviously, we've had to extend the hype cycle to things that are already in place and mature. That's on the right-hand side. And then they follow the hype cycle. And when I did this a long time ago, augmented reality was actually not even on the hype cycle. If you use the hype cycle as a legend, you actually get red is risk, gray is ready to go, and white dashed out are things that are not invented yet. So now what we have is an immediate risk assessment of this digital moment. And this one is quite good in the sense that it has a relatively lot of grays, blue, and green. So it's pretty safe. And what we really need to assess are the orange ones, the yellow ones, and of course the white dash ones. In this case, the reason that wireless as a service is yellow is that I used to really the point in this. The point is that when you identify the dots, you can attach different attributes to them that will help you decide what is the best digital moment. And one of my favorite attributes is actually to put in $1 sign or euro sign or real sign, I guess, in these circles. So 1 is cheap, 2 is medium, and 3 is expensive. So that gives you even more information about the cost of this particular digital moment. But I would argue that the real benefit of this actually comes when you have a lot of focus groups, when you create a lot of digital moments. Because what you can do then, because you have this structured qualitative framework in terms of the benefit map, you that are part of the leadership, you are part of the strategic team, can actually start stacking these benefit maps. And through this, you can identify a couple of things. So first, one of the things is obviously, typically looking in the enabler quadrant, you will find a lot of the same technologies. And when you do that, you understand that even if you don't know anything about the future, you know these are the things we need to start doing right now. So that's the first thing on your critical path of strategy. But more interestingly, in innovation, you can start looking at what are the low-hanging fruits in terms of digital moments. Let's say it's 2 and 3. You know you can do that quickly, you can get benefit very quickly out of that. Then those become the first ones on the roadmap. And of course, if you choose them wisely, they will also set up the next ones, like 5 and 6, which again then will set up the next one, which could be 4 or 8 or 9. So essentially what you're creating here is a roadmap that is very agile for the organization, taking into account all the good ideas from all the classrooms out there. I hope this makes sense. That's where I finished today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan. هل في إشارات series message عشان يكون السؤال واضح.